Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague from Georgia, fellow member of the Rules Committee, for yielding me time to speak on this important topic. Very pleased to be able to contribute to this conversation. Mr. Speaker, you probably know I'm a farmer, and I can tell you that growing crops, cultivating crops, can teach you a lot about a responsible regulatory process. And that may sound like a strange statement, but let me just say, I primarily grow hops and grapes, two crops that require a trellis system. And neither of these crops would be successfully grown without a good, strong trellis system that gives them structure and direction, support. However, on the flip side, if the trellises aren't constructed properly, if they're not maintained and kept in good working order, the crop growth would be affected. It would be stunted. Production, in the end, would suffer. Our regulatory process is very similar, Mr. Speaker. Congress passes laws intended to provide a pro-growth structure for our economy. Regulatory agencies build out and fill in the details based on the directions from us, from Congress. However, sometimes agencies provide regulations that can significantly harm people, harm businesses, and the jobs they're supposed to be supporting. Many times these regulations exceed or are in contravention to the direction or the authority provided by Congress. Many times it seems as if the regulators write these regulations for the sake of regulations, with little regard to the consequences to those that are forced to comply. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of this rule and the underlying legislation, as these bills will provide Congress and the American public with new tools to ensure that regulations truly have the public's best interest in mind and do not hinder economic expansion and growth. For example, H.R. 712 will prevent what's called the sue and settle tactics that are used to circumvent the normal rulemaking process. It's been well documented that on numerous regulations, the administration has intentionally dragged its feet and failed to propose a regulation in a timely fashion. So what happens then? They can be sued and ultimately settle on the terms decided solely by the court, by the administration, and by the plaintiff. This tactic has removed the cost-benefit analysis required for many economically significant regulations. But more importantly, it has eliminated stakeholder engagement in the regulatory process, as well as the public's right to comment on dozens of regulations with compliance costs totaling in the hundreds of millions to the billions of dollars. This legislation also includes other common sense measures, such as requiring agencies to post on the Internet in plain language 100-word summaries detailing what a regulation does. Few individuals or small businesses have neither the time nor the fleet of lawyers needed to pore over hundreds of pages of regulations and be expected to comment or comply. I was also proud to co-sponsor H.R. 1155, which this rule also provides for consideration. It's estimated that the current federal code spans more than 175,000 pages. This important legislation will enact a commission to review the regulatory code and make recommendations on which regulations are necessary, which are overlapping, which are duplicative or obsolete. Wouldn't it be refreshing, Mr. Speaker, a refreshing change if for once Washington, D.C. could actually cut red tape instead of creating new barriers to economic growth? Too often regulations have begun to have costs that far outweigh their benefits, seriously harming those they were intended to regulate and help and protect. Regulations resulting from sue and settle are often impossible to comply with. The public is removed from the rulemaking process. We can and we must do better. These common sense reforms in H.R. 712 and H.R. 1155 will help reverse the trend of regulation stunting growth and stalling production and restore the pro-growth oriented structure and direction that Congress has intended. Again, thank you to the gentleman for yielding to me, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.